Just like the bass line in a song, the soundtrack is something in the background of many shows that most of the time doesn't draw attention, but nonetheless supports the production, providing a strong base of support from which to connect to the viewer. And of course, those moments where the soundtrack proudly makes itself known are magical. Here are your nominees for Best Soundtrack of 2024.
ほんと。じゃあ、本当に行く？
十分に湯だったら完成じゃ。
ほう、飛べるのか。
面白い。
ゾルトラーク。
やけに白いんだ、やたら長いんだ、答えは大体形ばかりの常識だろ。
何？
ごきげんよう、人種。
And the winners for Best Soundtrack, the jury has selected Monogatari series Off and Monster Season. And the public has chosen Furiren Beyond Journey's End.
Shaybs, how much do you pay attention to a show's soundtrack? Is it something that's in the forefront of your mind as you're watching, or is it something that kind of provides impact in emotional scenes, but otherwise you don't really pay that much attention to it?
It's a half and half, I think. I think when a series does have a particular track, it doesn't even have to be like a collective soundtrack, but it has to just be like one track that stands out that's like, oh, this is great. Especially one that repeats and like kind of creates a motif, I think is really important. And not as many shows, I think, do that these days. And that's partly why the soundtrack might not stand out as much. But if it has as much presence as Freeren's soundtrack, then it's like hard to ignore, right? That was composed by Evan Call, who is probably best known for doing Violet Evergarden. Definitely showed up here with and brought like 70 tracks. It's just massive soundtrack. So it's no wonder that it has kind of left an impression on people.
I mean, I think Evan Call, such a wonderful composer. He's also well known, at least in my mind, for these like big sweeping like orchestral type of pieces, right? I mean, really stuff that like really lays on the emotion, which of course in a series like Freerin, which is all about kind of melancholy and this kind of reminiscence of the past that you can never get back, I think is quite fitting.
It was a sweeping epic fantasy, right? I know when it was coming out, people were really refreshed that it was like a pure fantasy action adventure series that didn't have these like otaku trappings, perhaps. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think people were really refreshed by that. And a lot of that is contributed by everything that Madhouse was doing on a production level, as well as Evan Call's soundtrack that gave it this very classic, old school kind of feeling to it that made it feel like you're watching something special.
But at the same time, one of the tracks that people really laud a lot is Zoltrack, which is it's like the third or fourth track. I mean, it's like the third or fourth episode. But I find that those kind of tracks have this almost kind of supernatural synthy techno-y quality. But since it's being applied to a sort of like supernatural magic element, science, technology, I think the series blends the two ideas quite well.
Yeah, it's definitely modernized. I wouldn't say it feels like something that John Williams would propose or something like that. I wouldn't go that far. But yeah, I think it's very modern and up to the sensibilities and everything. Yeah. And it's surprising that for the public, at least of the 5 nominees, it beat out 2 different music related anime. Girls Bad Cry and Sound Euphonium 3 are about music and couldn't snag the original soundtrack award from Freerin.
Caleb, would you mind giving us some thoughts about Freerun, what the jury thought about it, and it's kind of why the public would be drawn to it, in your opinion?
Freerun was one of the best soundtracks of the year, I think, for both the jury and the public. And you guys kind of touched on it already, but it does like the fantasy adventure kind of swoon very well with like large and vast strings and woodwinds. It like kind of highlights their journey through these like expansive unknown lands, and it like invites you into their world and is like very whimsical and ethereal. But then you have the battle tracks like Zoltrack that like highlight the battle sequences, and they're very epic in scale and large. So I can totally see how the soundtrack specifically in Freerun like gets you very engaged in the story and the world and the characters.
What I also want to point out is that a lot of what Freerun is about memory. It's about carrying someone's memory through your life, even after they're long gone. And Shaybs, you mentioned leitmotifs or motifs in general that play.
Yeah, leitmotifs is more of the track. Yeah.
Himmel's theme is one that people point out quite a lot. Is it a kind of thing where Himmel's theme will show up in certain situations to kind of remind the audience of him as Freerun is remembering him?
Yeah, they have a lot of flashbacks, and leitmotifs are kind of a thing that's always talked about through, well, with discussion through soundtrack, like sort of off topic, but I know like Metallic Rouge and Monogatari specifically did leitmotifs very heavily to like call back specific instances or themes. And I think Freyren also probably did that with Himmel's theme, because there's, tons of flashbacks going back to Freerin remembering her past party members and how she can relate that to her current journey, which kind of ties the whole story together in a way.
It makes sense that Monogatari has that strength with leitmotifs because it's probably not just referring back to previous parts of its own soundtrack, but previous parts of the soundtrack from an entire franchise that it's a part of. The latest in a very long running franchise since like 2010. And the composers, Kei Haneoka and Satoru Kosaki, both have worked on the series for a very long time. So they have the kind of advantage that a lot of these other nominees might not have, in which they have this kind of existing catalog to rely on. I'm not sure how much often Monster Season uses previous tracks, but that's something that you have when you have a longer franchise. You can keep adding on to the soundtrack and create potentially more effective repertoire that like longtime viewers get very familiar with certain ideas and instrument choices and things like that, and it reinforces the soundtrack, giving specific. And Monogatari has a very particular identity with like the kind of instruments it uses and the types of songs that it chooses to use.
I mean, right off the bat, the OP for Natiko Draw is a direct callback to Renai Circulation. I mean, no, they say the thing.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the same thing. That Nadeko is like a main focus for good part of the season, and that is like a character specific leitmotif that gets repeated. It's like a Renai Circulation kind of remix in a way. And I think they do a good job at calling back previous seasons, since like a lot of the characters are recurring throughout, season on season.
I think that's a really important point to make because again, a lot of the first part of Monogatari is kind of Natiko's final arc, right? It's her reconciling with her past selves, like literally and metaphorically. To have that little piece of history crop back up and then get resolved musically is quite fitting. It's really nice.
Yeah, and only a series that really takes its time and puts all that work in to create that payoff is able to create those intensive moments. Whereas a lot of the nominees here are just getting started, which hopefully they can have some more longevity to them in the future.
Caleb, I had a quick question. What do you think of Dan to Dan? I think had a little bit of a controversial moment where
Hmm.
they just played like what is it's not taps. Fly of the Bumblebee? Some famous classical piece. Um,
Oh, okay.
I think people thought it was a choice. Was that a talking point in the jury at all?
Yeah, it was like oh man, I'd have to go back through the discussion, but I forget the exact name of the track, but the first time it plays is like episode 4, when they're running away from Turbo Granny, and The first time we heard it, everyone was like, "Oh my god, that was awesome!" But then it plays again this like later on in the series, and everyone was like, "Okay, it was cool the first time, but like it feels a little silly to play it again." It didn't hit as hard, I guess you could say.
It doesn't come off the same way as like a leitmotif as we're talking about. That's constantly reinforcing and kind of. I like it when a soundtrack is able to bind scenes together because like you like this track and then it's playing in a similar moment. I like when tracks are used often and the soundtrack is more limited than something like Bebop or I just finished rewatching Bebop. It's like it feels like every episode has like its own soundtrack and it's just this incredibly massive long thing and that's its own appeal of like a track is only associated with one scene and that's it. But it's just two different approaches.
You know, a past guest of ours, the wonderful Rose Bridges, wrote a book about Cowboy Bebop soundtrack called Yoko Kanno's Cowboy Bebop soundtrack. Excellent read. So full of music theory. It's very great. I give it a recommendation. But yeah, final question. What do you guys think about, Shapes, you brought it up a little bit earlier, the fact that these like music focus shows are have kind of not done so well up against these other I mean,
Especially the jury. The jury found Girls Band Cry to be like number 10.
well, here's the thing, right? So
And Sound
just because
UFO
a
number 9,
show
actually.
just because a show's about music doesn't
Right.
necessarily
Yeah, they really
mean
good. Yeah,
like
interesting.
it's about usage. It's about and Hibike season 3, has some criticisms about omitting certain performances and the like. So, but Caleb,
Mm.
do you mind explaining a little bit about this kind of situation?
Yeah, I think you just touched on it there, but like most of the backing soundtrack in Sound UFO 3 is just like very samey. Like it's composed well, but when you're watching 12 episodes in a row, trying to find like unique, fun, interesting tracks that really get you engaged, most of us did not find that Sound UFO did. And a lot of the performances like could have been done better, let's say, or included. Whereas Girls Band Cry, I think a lot of us like the performances quite a bit, but I think a lot of the slice of life tracks kind of left a little bit to be desired in terms of repetitiveness and kind of being too on the nose when overlaid with the kind of extra melodrama through the show. And that's not to say that we thought they were bad. They're still top 10 of the year. It's just, we have to give something ninth and 10th, right?
Oh yeah, it's just ironic, really, with the because I think that makes complete sense. Where perhaps the composers didn't want a backing track that the characters themselves are not playing to upstage uh, their own performance. I wonder if that's like a challenge for the music composers of these shows, where they're trying to find that balance of like, you don't want to leave the rest of the shows that when they're not playing music to feel completely void, like no soundtrack at all. But I imagine there's like that challenge of, ooh, what if I compose something that is really beautiful and like means a lot, but there's like a disconnect with playing their own music and it's not as good maybe.
Well, this has been a lovely conversation. Thank you so much for speaking with me, guys.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And to continue another positive leitmotif of the stream, here's a message from a very special person. Thank you to everybody at Our Anime for this great honor. Writing the music for Freerun Beyond Journey's End was so much fun and really took me back to my folk music roots. I worked to combine a mixture of Celtic and Americana with orchestra to bring a sense of nostalgia, hope, and excitement to the already amazing world of Freerun. And I'm so happy that you all enjoyed my soundtrack. I'll work extra hard to bring you even more for Season 2, which I'm composing right at this moment. I hope someday to do more orchestra concerts and to take you all on a musical journey. But until then, the road to Enda continues.